So once upon a time there was a soda called 7-Up. And 7-Up had a big red dot in its logo thing. Somewhere along the way, someone had the bright idea to turn that dot into a mascot, so they gave the dot arms, legs, a mouth, and some shades, and voila, you got Spot! And Spot became a thing. And when you have a thing, you have the video games. And this is one of them. Spot the video game for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Also available for Game Boy, MS-DOS, Atari ST, and Commodore Amiga. This is actually the first video game to feature Spot, before you get a couple other games along the way, including the only one people seem to care about, Cool Spot. So what you see before you is Spot the video game, a 7x7 grid where you have one chip on two corners of the grid, while your opponent has their own chips on the other two corners. Unless, of course, you're playing a game with 4 players, in which case each player has a chip on their own corner of the grid. Inspired by the old arcade game known as Attacks, players take turns moving their chips across the grid. You can move one space, which will replicate a new chip, thus giving you more control over the board, or you could jump up to 2 spaces, which will not replicate a chip and potentially leave you open to attack. When you land a chip next to an enemy chip, they become your chip, thus giving you more control over the playfield. You can claim multiple enemy chips within close proximity with carefully placed jumps. Watch out, your enemy can do the same to you and claim your chips for themselves. Whoever can claim all the chips on the board wins. If all possible moves have been exhausted, then the player with the most chips on the board ends up winning. You only play one game, and then win or lose, it's back to the title screen. Spot the video game gives you options to alter the difficulty setting of the computer AI up to 5 levels. Place a timer on your turn so you have a time limit on how long you have to make your moves. Or you can edit the board so that certain areas cannot be crossed or occupied, adding an extra bit of strategy to the fold. You could design your own layouts, or you could choose from a large number of randomly selected layouts, which sort of mixes the gameplay up a bit. And if playing with the computer is a bit of a chore, then you could play with another human player, or 2, or 3, as Spot the video game is one of the few games on the NES that supports up to 4-player gameplay. Although you're not using a 4-score multi-tap satellite thing to achieve this, you're basically passing the 2 controllers back and forth whenever it's the other player's turn, which is kinda cumbersome, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. Kind of, I guess. Maybe. So here's the deal. Spot the video game is a very simple game with a very simple premise. There's not a whole lot to it, it's not the most exciting thing in the world, and while there are options, they're not the really crazy options that drastically alter gameplay, but the little options that change little things, like the timing and the difficulty and which spaces you can't pass through. Spot the video game could have been boring fare, based on this simple premise and its limited options, but instead provides players with a cunning computer opponent who is exceptional at countering your moves. Level 1 or 2 might not be the most threatening bits and could be easily conquered somewhat with some semblance of skill, but bump it up 3 or 4 and you've got a fight on your hands. And if you think that's easy enough for you, then go bump it up all the way to 5 and, well, that's where the fun really begins, I suppose. Spot offers a bit of an addictive quality to it in the gameplay that is both simple to understand and yet not quite as simple to conquer. Add to that the ability to customize the boards, and there's a plethora of possibility to the number of gameplay scenarios that could be cooked up. But even without that, this is a fun game. The perfect kind of game to play with friends, especially those not well versed in the video game world. Control is simple, functional, and straightforward for a game like this. It's not overly complicated. It's, just say, here's a controller, you just move the thing, you pick a thing, and you do the other thing, and it's simple. It's easy to get into. Spot's visual quality is simplistic and to the point. You have a grid, you have dots, they're different colors, pretty straightforward and simple to understand. A neat touch with this version of Spot the video game is whenever you make a move, Spot will perform one of several animations, moving from one spot to another, no pun intended, that are actually quite charming and really well done, to be honest. It's a neat little touch that makes the game that much more special. And while you have Spot moving around, you have some decent sounding musical cues playing, for a brief moment. Nothing really mind-blowing, and ultimately your mileage may vary with a couple pieces which are kind of hit and miss, but ultimately, I don't think they're bad tunes at all, even if they are a bit brief. Overall, Spot the video game is a relatively simple game that is surprisingly fun and replayable given what little it has to offer in terms of the core gameplay. It's one of those games you could play a couple quick games and be done with it, or you could play several games for hours on end and fiddle around with the board editor to add a bit of challenge and strategy to the whole thing. It also makes for a great multiplayer game if you can find the folks to join in on the fun. Of the two versions of Spot that I've played, the NES version is perhaps the best of the two, given the animations and the potential 4-player, 4-corners action that makes for some great friendly fire. But any way you slice it, Spot's first video game outing is definitely a strong showing despite its relatively simple premise. One worth checking out for those wanting something simple in their video gaming.